And now we are all left to face with the ramifications of dealing with this over the last 15, 60 years, where we're coming to the end game of this. So the next few years are going to be very volatile economically, very turbulent.
Okay, why is the US and Trump throwing these tariffs around? What is going on? How does it apply to Canada? Here's basically what's happening. And to explain this, because we're getting a lot of questions around it, I want to back up for a second to some headlines that have happened over the last few weeks, just to set up what we're about to discuss. So the first one I'm going to throw up here is this one, where it says Trump proposes abolishment of federal income tax, bringing the US back to the richest period in history. So when you see what he's talking about here, if you look into this a little bit and pull out some of the quotes, like this one from that, it says, "It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before. You know, the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs. And that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking." And if you look at some of the data, this is Mark Andreessen threw this together and put this up on X. Basically, the flat line that's highlighted on this is zero tariff. Federal income in the US from tariffs is basically zero for like the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. But before that, if you go back like 100 years, 150 years, you can see a lot of the federal income in the US came from tariffs. So there is some precedent for tariffs being a larger chunk of the federal income in the US. We can all debate if that's right or wrong or whatever, but this is what Trump seems to be referring to. And then if you go to the new Secretary of the Treasury in the US, Scott Bessent, he has these quotes that have been floating around. Scott Bessent pushes gradual 2.5% universal US tariffs plan. And if you go into some of the comments in there, he talks about some of this stuff. I'm going to jump into the second paragraph in this little section here. It says the 2.5% levy would move higher by the same amount each month, the people familiar with it said, giving businesses time to adjust and countries the chance to negotiate with the US president's administration. The levies could be pushed up to as high as 20%, in line with Trump's maximalist position on the campaign trail last year, but a gradual introduction would be more moderate than the immediate action some countries feared. So even Scott Bessent is kind of saying, yeah, like these tariffs are coming. Maybe his approach is more moderate and starting with a smaller amount and increasing them. And maybe Trump is just throwing these big numbers out there and he's going to settle for some less. And it's a bit of a negotiation tactic, kind of straight out of his book, The Art of the Deal. So maybe that is what's happening. But if you look at the next quote here, Trump says, "We have to bring production back to our country."
Hey everyone, I've got a quick shout out about the Your Life, Your Terms report. This is Tom's weekly newsletter where he and Nick share real stories, experiences, and powerful insights to help you live life on your terms. Each week, Tom breaks down the economy, real estate, macro trends, and Bitcoin, and gives you actionable steps to make these insights work for you. No fluff, no vague predictions, just a clear path to thriving no matter what's going on in the world. Tens of thousands of Canadians are already getting the real information they need to level up their lives every week. I can honestly say it's the only newsletter that I've stayed subscribed to for years. It delivers real value that keeps me coming back for more. Join us and start getting the insights and tools to create the life you want, plus entertaining and inspiring stories from Tom and Nick along the way. Sign up for free at rockstarinnercircle.com/get-started and start living life on your terms. That's rockstarinnercircle.com/get-started. Your first step to living life on your terms.
And I think that's what this is ultimately all about, or it's what the public-facing answer to why they're doing tariffs or talking about tariffs is. And if you look at the Treasury Secretary's quote here from middle of January, he says, "I believe Wall Street has done great the past few years and that Main Street in the US has suffered. I think it's Main Street's time. Wall Street can continue to do well, maybe not as well, and it's time to have a Main Street." And of course, he's talking about Main Street in the US. So this kind of gives us some serious clues that they're basically proposing a complete reorder to the system that has been in effect from the 1970s. So this is a big deal. And it seems like this is all happening to me because of something that has been very well known when one country has a currency that is acting as the global reserve asset of the entire world, like the US dollar is acting or has been acting. And it's something that an economist named Robert Triffin talked about and exposed to Congress in the US way back in the 1960s. He basically foretold that this was going to happen. We were going to get into a situation where a monetary reorder was going to have to happen. And it looks like we might be entering the main thick of that reorder right now. So if you look at how he describes Triffin's dilemma here in this graphic, and I don't know who to give credit to for this graphic, it's been floating around the internet for some time, but I think it does a good job here. I want to read to you what he's saying and how he breaks it down. So I'm going to start on the left part of this graphic here, where he says, if the United States stopped running balance of payments deficits, balance of payment deficit meaning that if they stopped sending out more US dollars, so if they stopped buying more things from outside of the country to bring in, this would leave the world with a lack of US dollars. They literally have to run a balance of payment deficit, a trade deficit in the US, where they're buying stuff from the outside of the US more than they're exporting. And they need to do that because the US is the reserve asset. The US dollar is the reserve asset. And this is a way for the rest of the world to get their hands on US dollars when the US itself runs a trade deficit and sends out more US dollars and buys things from outside of the country more than it exports itself. So the international community would lose its largest source of additional reserves. The resulting shortage of liquidity could pull the world economy into a contractionary spiral, leading to instability. So he's basically saying when we have a global system where the US dollar is acting as the world's reserve asset and countries all around the world need to get their hands on it to put it on their balance sheet in their country, the US has to run these trade deficits. And what happens with that is the US eventually, when they import more than they export, they end up losing their manufacturing base, they lose their factories, they lose the production that's happening in the US as they keep buying more and more from outside of the US. The manufacturing and the production that was happening inside the US eventually goes to those countries outside of the US, just kind of like naturally what happens when you import more than you export in that country. And on the right-hand side, he continues here on this graphic. I want to read this. If UF deficits continued, a steady stream of dollars would continue to fuel world economic growth, which is what has happened. These deficits in the US have continued. In fact, the deficits are so large in the US right now, even in the last few years when there has not been a recession, they are running in the US recession level deficits. Deficits right now in the US are about 6% of US GDP. That is a recession level deficit, meaning they are spending way more money than they have. They're running these large deficits and this money is slushing all around the world. However, excessive US deficits would erode confidence in the value of the US dollar. Without confidence in the dollar, it would no longer be accepted as the world's reserve currency. The fixed exchange rate system could break down, leading to instability. This is exactly what gold seems to be telling us in today's world. With gold at $3,000 an ounce, it's kind of a sign to exactly what Robert Triffin is saying here, that there is some loss of confidence in the dollar. I mean, gold is kind of signaling that to the world right now. So Triffin's dilemma has kind of, been put off. It kind of made it through the 1970s where the system didn't break down when the US managed to get the rest of the world buying US treasuries in that time. And it managed to get through the great financial crisis with quantitative easing. And that was the birth of quantitative easing when the central banks then realized, oh my gosh, we could just print a lot of money and just stuff it directly into the system by buying different things from banks to kind of keep the system going. But now it seems like they're running out of options and this might be coming home to roost. And I want to read the next part of this graphic to you, Triffin's solution. What he's saying here is Triffin proposed the creation of new reserve units. These units would not depend on gold or currencies. So think of like a neutral monetary unit that didn't belong to one country, but they would add to the world's total liquidity. Creating such a new reserve would allow the United States to reduce its balance of payments deficits while still allowing for global economic expansion. And then there's a quote here, a fundamental reform of the international monetary system has long been overdue. Its necessity and urgency are further highlighted today by the imminent threat to the once mighty US dollar. So he was calling this back in 1960 And through different monetary magic moves, it looks like they've managed to keep this system going for a lot longer than anyone thought, definitely longer than Robert Triffin thought. But a lot of this seems to be happening now where Trump and Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, seem to understand that they need to onshore a bunch of production, because if they keep this balance of payments deficit going, the lack of confidence in the US dollar is going to extrapolate from here at a much faster rate. So it's almost like they realize, holy smokes, we can't keep playing this game that we started, and we now need to correct ourselves here. We need to get some production, some manufacturing, some economic activity back onshore in the US. And the one way we're going to do that is we're going to go around to all our trading partners and just start throwing tariffs on things. And so this is why this is happening. It's not really just something out of the blue. It's really that the monetary system globally has major cracks in it, with the US dollar at the center of it. And this is the way that they think they're going to try and correct it. Now, we can all argue if this is going to work, if it's right or wrong. I'm not here to debate that. I'm just saying that this is a direct result of the system that we find itself in. You can't have one nation's currency acting as the reserve monetary asset for the rest of the world without these problems coming up. And now we are all left to face with the ramifications of dealing with this over the last 15, 60 years, where we're coming to the end game of this. So the next few years are going to be very volatile economically, very turbulent. We need to prepare for a lot of, unlike the 2010s that was just very stable with low rates, and it was just like very consistent. This decade has already been volatile. I just feel until we get through this, the volatility is going to increase. So we all need to brace ourselves. So to me, this is why this is happening. It's a monetary thing. You can't have one single nation's currency acting as the reserve asset for the entire world. You need a neutral reserve asset. So hopefully you find that helpful. Talk to you soon.